Hi class, my name is Caitlin Sheridan and I'm the somewhat silent observer from Guatemala, and I want to spend a few minutes today talking about the tutoring session that I did with one of my students. For my tutoring sessions, I worked with a 15-year-old Korean as a first language male. He's currently a student in a bilingual English and Spanish school in Guatemala City, but before moving to Guatemala last year from Korea, he studied English but had a far greater emphasis on the grammatical concepts of English and not necessarily the verbal communication. Conversational English has really only become a focus within the past 2 years since arriving in Guatemala because it is his lingua franca until he learned Spanish. He started in my English language arts class around March of last year, and when he first arrived, we could only communicate through a translation app on my phone because Korean is really not in my linguistic repertoire, and he didn't speak any English whatsoever. And now here we are almost a year later, and he speaks fairly fluently and can carry on very basic conversations in English. He can express himself, he can for the most part, ask questions and figure out what he needs to know. But during the diagnostic exam, there were a few problem areas that came to light, but I'm his literature teacher, so I see him every day, and I was there from the beginning until this point in terms of his language growth. And I'm also somewhat biased in wanting him to hone skills that will help him in my class. So prior to this, I noticed that he usually can produce sounds fairly appropriately in free conversation. However, when he reads aloud, he tends to have issues with pronouncing certain sounds and certain words, and he also has a little bit of an issue with creating the appropriate stress patterns when he speaks and when he reads aloud. So because of this, I walked into our diagnostic exam with those features in mind, and then based on what he produced during that diagnostic, we narrowed down his biggest problem areas to the L and the R sounds, as well as the stress patterns within sentences. So for the first session, we focused primarily on the L and the R sounds. Those sounds do not exist in Korean, which creates obvious difficulty when working on his English language acquisition. So our first session began with explaining what we were going to be working on and having him look at the way that the sounds were created in his mouth. I did this by having him look into a mirror as he created the sound so that he could see the way that the sound was formed as he moved his tongue back and forth. Then we moved into, and then he had to mark it out on a stencil that I created. And that stencil is seen right here. So like if you create the sound up here, you put an X up here. If it comes out forward and it's by your teeth, you put an X by your teeth, so that he had a visual representation as well as seeing himself create the two different sound combinations. So from there, we moved into minimal pairs drills. And my intention with that was to have him continue to look into the mirror as he was creating those sounds so he could watch himself moving the tongue back and forth and back and forth. However, in true adolescent fashion, he was really, really uncomfortable with watching himself in the mirror. And so I decided that it was probably a better option to let him feel comfortable. And so we got rid of the mirror and I just let him work based on the tactile experience of the tongue moving back and forth. So when the sound occurred in the final position of the word, he really had a difficult time with understanding and hearing the differences between the two sounds, which he was very much loath to admit because I've had this experience with other students from that culture. They don't want to admit when they don't understand something because maybe it's seen as they're not smart enough or they have difficulty learning, which isn't okay. And so I pressed him very hard to tell me when he didn't understand that stuff. And eventually he admitted that he had a really hard time with understanding the differences between the two. He did get a little bit more comfortable as we moved through the different practices, but I think that the tactile part of the sound production was way more effective with the auditory experience of the differences between the two sounds. I imagine that the auditory component will come with time and practice, but for now he definitely seems to rely on the tactile of moving the tongue back and forth and back and forth. which didn't seem like a problem as long as he's aware of it and as he's noticing that, this is how the word needs to sound when it's got the R, and this is how the word has to sound when it's got the L. I think that the most successful portion of this tutoring session was the information gap activity that I created. I used the names of my students' classmates and gave them silly professions, silly places of origins, and I think that helped to make it a little bit more interesting for him. And I think because of that, he was more engaged in the activity, as any 15-year-old would be when they have to spend extra time with their teacher to practice their speaking abilities and can't go hang out with their friends at lunch. But so if I were going to do that again, I would probably add a little bit more scaffolding to the assignment, just because he did not answer in complete sentences, and there was a lot of just like fragmented questions and fragmented answers. So if I were to do it again, I would give him specific questions to fill in the blank with and specific statements to fill in the blank with, to introduce those grammatical components and make it a habit of using those grammatical components. And then later on, I would take those metaphorical training wheels off and insist that he start speaking in complete sentences and speaking in complete questions. At this point, it wasn't a huge priority to me to have him speak that way. As much as it killed my literature English teacher heart to have him chunking it up, I did think it was probably a symptom of the English language acquisition, and that he just doesn't have the words to think about L and R components and then also come up with questions at the same time, at least not yet. And it also was on my part. It was my part not reinforcing the fact that he had to speak in complete sentences. So it's just something that I would tweak for the future if I was going to do it again. For our second session, the second session focused largely on stress patterns within a language. To introduce this concept, I gave the student an information sheet that included certain rules for how the stress patterns work, and we focused on 2 of the 5 that I gave him. Now, as I created this lesson plan, I thought that I had enough information to deliver the content and be fine. But as I was delivering the information, I was hit with a sensation that kind of told me otherwise. So, as a teacher, I have become accustomed to this feeling that pops up occasionally when I am teaching a concept and the whole thing feels very up in the air. And this sensation usually crops up whenever I'm teaching something theoretical that needs to be applied to certain circumstances, and my scaffolding has not been sufficient enough to really bring the concept down to a manageable level for the students. More or less, it appears when I feel as if my students are guessing rather than actually critically thinking about, taking the rule and applying it to the reality. So as we were working through simple sentences to identify the content word that would receive the stress, it really felt that he was at first guessing which one was the most important word. And as we went through the sentences, he seemed to grasp the pattern a little bit more securely, and did okay with it. However, I really felt that I really wished that I had included something tactile for him in the scaffolding portion of that lesson, as opposed to just looking at the sheet and explaining it and working through examples. I wish I had had something that he could really put his hands around. Based on the successes that he's had in the previous lessons, the tactile learning style really seems to be what works for him. And I believe it's probably because of the language barrier that he doesn't yet have the words in English to associate concepts with what he's going through in his language usage. And the ability to touch and feel is something that doesn't necessarily need language. So I wish I had done something like that. So if I were to continue working on this lesson and perhaps reproduce it in the future, or continue to work with a student on doing this type of work, I would perhaps integrate a clapping exercise where we clap out the syllables of the sentence and emphasize where the stresses fall, or listening to an audio recording and tapping out the stress patterns, just so that he has something tactile to grasp onto as he's trying to figure out what goes where. But despite this, I really felt like at the end of the lesson he did start to grasp a little bit of the concept, and he did learn something about stressing within sentences in English. Retrospectively, it was not the best lesson I've ever taught, but I do think he did learn something new, and I think it was beneficial in his work towards getting a natural-like cadence. He also was very, very successful in differentiating between the L and the R after our work together, both in the tutoring session, and I've noticed it coming up in class. Oftentimes if he has to read something in class and he messes it up, all I have to say is, "What?" And he repeats it, and it's correct this time, which is great to see as a teacher, both as an obvious sign of his learning and also because I know that he's improving. So overall, my biggest takeaway from these sessions was how necessary it is to find a way to incorporate the many different learning styles within tutoring sessions. In a classroom setting, I can hit them day by day, and I also am not focused on one student in particular. But here we had limited time, and it's one-on-one, and everything can be about the student. So I really saw the importance of identifying the student's learning style and integrating it quickly into the lesson. It also became apparent to me that the tactile or kinesthetic element of teaching language is really, really a lot more important than I think it gets in the average classroom, because when the kids don't have the words to associate where things should go or what things should sound like, they can always fall back on the physical portion of it, which I think is important. I think that because I'm not particularly accustomed to using tactile or kinesthetic learning in my classroom, it was not my first instinct. In my current classroom, the last time I let the kids get up and move around, a kid got punched in the nose, so it's not really my go-to move, but it is something that I want to incorporate further into more of my lessons and more of future tutoring, because it was so successful in this case, in this scenario. That concludes my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to me as much as I enjoyed writing it and working with the student. If you have any questions about my presentation, you can reach me on Moodle, or you can reach me at my University of Illinois email address. I hope you enjoyed.